Welcome to the online Calvin Symposium on Worship, a first for us at the Calvin Worship Institute. My name is Joanna Wigboldy, and I'm a program manager at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship, and I am delighted to be facilitating this conversation today. And I am especially excited to have help from some students in the Calvin Ministry Leadership Cohort in facilitating this conversation. Karolyn, Bethany, and Sheila are Calvin sophomores with different majors, but who all have a common calling to participate in the life of the church in a unique way. In the Ministry Leadership Cohort, students build community, practice leadership, and love the church. And they do this by taking courses together, by discussing leadership and ministry in small groups, by interacting with ministry leaders, and many other opportunities that we give them. This semester, sophomores in the cohort have the opportunity to practice leadership in the context of the worship symposium. And so we give them the training to do that and have them walk alongside a staff member in preparing for that. So that's why they're here with me today, and I'm really excited about that. Now let me introduce our panelists. Rich Villodas is the Brooklyn-born lead pastor of New Life Fellowship, a large multiracial church in Queens that has more than 75 countries represented in its community. He is the author of this book, The Deeply Formed Life, 5 Transformative Values That Root Us in the Way of Jesus. And this book is sort of the guiding resource for our conversation today. You can see I took the title for our conversation, Deeply Formed Ministry, right from his book, The Deeply Formed Life. So thank you, Rich, for that. Jennifer Holmes Curran co-pastors Sherman Street Christian Reformed Church in Grand Rapids alongside her husband, Tony. She is passionate about good preaching and writing and restorative practices in the church. Jen is my pastor, and it's clear to me as a parishioner that the practices that Rich talks about in his book, inner examination, contemplative rhythms, racial justice, that those things shape her life and her preaching. And that's why I've invited her to be part of this conversation today. Danjuma Gibson is an associate professor of pastoral care at Calvin Seminary. He is also in private practice as a psychotherapist in Grand Rapids. Prior to joining Calvin Seminary, Danjuma was the senior pastor of a church in Chicago for over 16 years, and during that time was bivocational as a commercial banker. So I'm eager to hear how those experiences have formed his ministry and then how that helps him form students for ministry. So thank you all for being here for this conversation. As I mentioned, the theme of this panel really is taken from Rich's book, The Deeply Formed Life. In the book, Rich outlines 5 core values that guide his ministry at New Life Fellowship. So that's 5 chapters of the book, and then there's a corresponding chapter of practices that cultivate each of these values. I talked with Rich about his book a few months ago, and you can listen to that conversation in the Symposium podcast series. You're welcome to pause this panel discussion and listen to it now, or you can go back and listen to it after you listen to this discussion. In that conversation, Rich and I discussed the specific values in the book and their associated practices for congregations with a special focus on worship. But today, Rich is here with me again, along with Danjuma and Jen, to focus on how these practices and maybe some others are essential to sustaining those in ministry. So one of the key themes I took from the book is the way that each of these practices helps us enter into what God is doing. Rich writes at the end of the book, any talk of being engaged in the world must begin not with activity, but with a life in God. We know that's very countercultural in a world that tells us that our busyness, the things that we do are what gives us value. Rich names this when he writes again, there's a way of responding to the needs of the world that leads to fatigue and burnout. We try to give what we don't possess, and every time we attempt this, we put ourselves in danger. The deeply formed mission is fundamentally about becoming a particular person and offering that to the world. So today, we are exploring with these pastors what happens when they do try to work out of their own strength, and what practices they turn to in order to do their ministry out of God's strength. So Karolyn is going to get the conversation started.
Our first question is, would you be able to describe a ministry that is led by someone operating out of their own strength? Danjuma, would you be able to start us off?
Sure. Describe a ministry led by someone operating out of their own strength. I want to be careful with answering that because I don't want to appear judgmental. So don't think that I'm speaking of any particular ministry. So I'll answer that from a 50,000 foot perspective. I think that could be any church in America that adheres to sort of this consumerist type of mentality where ministry is, or the people of God are only imagined on a Sunday morning. And when we adhere to an ethic of productivity, membership growth, financial growth, when that tends to be the sort of unconscious telos of what people imagine, and that can be difficult in the day of social media, because you can be a pastor and you'll have members. I mean, when I was growing up in the 80s, I'm dating myself, 90s, we didn't have social media. It was television, but there was more community, embodied community on a Sunday. Now people get satisfaction out of getting 50 likes if they just say something, or say something that's popular. And so when you're operating out of your own strength, I imagine that to be, there's no divine creativity, there's no divine courage to imagine that creativity. Instead, there's sort of this, sometimes I'll tell my students to be careful about prefabricated ministry ideas, as if it's coming off of an assembly line, because over the long run, you won't last trying to materialize that. You'll burn out.
Jen, would you be able to describe this type of ministry?
Sure. I mean, I'm guilty of it a lot, so I don't, want to. I think it's really easy to be like, to say we all live in this wonderful way, and I just want to put right out there that I think it's a battle to not get sucked into the values of our culture, which, our productivity. And I mean, essentially, it comes down to treating ourselves, our congregation, like machines. Can we pump out the right things at the right times? And I think it often tends toward, I've heard heard pastors say, I work 80 hours a week as if it's a mark of pride. And that is not actually what God asks us to do. So I think there's anything that steps away from our created humanity, that makes us bigger than just one of God's creatures. It lets us imagine ourselves as more powerful than that. I think I have to continually return to just how small I am in the midst of the world. I think that's an important practice, to not get sucked into, I can control everything can be perfect. I somehow have to manipulate my congregation into looking a particular way, like all these different things that buy into like image is everything, productivity is everything, and in these places, that's where my worth is. So Yeah, I think, I mean, in a lot of ways, for me, when I kind of fall victim to that, it looks a lot more like tightly grasping something rather than releasing it. It looks a lot more like trying to control something, like micromanaging it, rather than allowing the body of Christ to do its work. Yeah, there's a lot of different things you could say, but generally it takes the form of some form of capitulation to a culture that really prioritizes money, the bottom line, very measurable, measurable things, which you can't really measure virtue. So we move, once we get caught in that, you start to move away from the kingdom and more into what our culture values more highly, I guess.
Rich, what do you have to add about operating out of one's own strength?
As Pastor Jen said, the reason why this is easy for me to name is because these are some of my own besetting sins. When I think about someone operating out of their own strength, the first thing that comes to mind is prayerlessness as an indicator that I'm operating out of my own strength. And I know what it's like to lead, to preach, to train, and do it out of a place where I'm just operating out of my gifts, operating out of my own strengths. But those things are very, very limiting. So prayerlessness for me is one of probably the key indicator that I am operating out of my own strength, which leads, I mean, here's some other words that come to mind: drivenness. I'm not led by the Spirit. There's a drivenness to my life. And from the outside, it might look the same. Someone who's led by God and someone who's driven by our own superficial needs or whatever it is. On the outside, it might look the same. But internally, I know the difference when I'm being led by God and when I'm being driven by my own goals in mind. I think about overfunctioning. And so overfunctioning, I mean, and the ways that we use it at New Life is doing for others what they can and should do for themselves. That's overfunctioning. And whether because of perfectionism, which is another line they're operating out of. I mean, I'm so familiar with these things, perfectionism. I want it to be done a certain way. Therefore, I'm going to overfunction. And then, I mean, the other phrase that comes to mind is there's not a sharing of the burden of leadership. I become like the be all end all, and there's no sharing of the burden. There is no cultivating and the fanning into flame of other people's gifts. There is no delegation. There is no releasing others. It becomes I'm the show, so to speak. So those are some of the language words, perfectionism, overfunctioning, prayerlessness, lack of burden sharing. Those are some of the things that come to mind when I think about someone who's operating out of their own strength.
Thank you. So that was almost, go ahead, Jen.
Didn't mean to interrupt you, Joanna.
Go ahead.
No, there's this really great quote by Bernard of Clairvaux that my husband and I return to often. And you're going to have to look it up because I'm about to butcher it. But he says, he compares a canal to a reservoir and says, lots of Christians function as canals. Like as soon as they have some amount of energy, some amount of even the goodness of God, they then turn around and try to give it out. And he encourages people to be reservoirs, to allow themselves to fill up so that, he says, so that they can shed abroad what they've been given without loss to themselves. So we turn back to that quote a lot to say it's not just about giving everything that I have, but it's also about maintaining some measure of health and I don't know, spiritual fullness, whatever you want to call that, that allows us to give without losing from our own selves.
Thanks. Danjuma, did you have something you want to add?
No, I'm just, I'm appreciating the responses from Rich and Jen. And make no mistake, when I was pastoring, I was guilty of it as well. But I would just add in there the complexity of it. We're talking about it individually, But the complexity of it is, depending on your church polity, if you are evaluated based on these performance metrics, that's where the challenge becomes. The challenge, it gets infinitely more difficult. And it is where I believe personally that the generation of pastors that are retiring, it's those pastors that can look back at a congregation and say, you know what? We have to change our ways for the next pastor, or we're going to burn them out. Churches don't like change at all. And so sometimes it can be misleading to think that there is an individual, young, intelligent pastor that's just going to come in and change the world. That's not going to happen. People can vote with their pocketbooks. People can vote with their feet. But especially if you have a church polity, one that's congregational or one that's more, whatever, depending on how that works out, if you are judged in that way of productivity, it's a more complex matter that we have to pay attention to.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. What I'm hearing is that it's actually really easy to do. It's really easy to try and function out of your own strength. And Rich, when you were talking, it just felt like, oh, yep, I resonate with that. Oh, and that, like I think a lot of us can hear ourselves in that. And I think that highlights the fact that it's something we all need to be aware of. And that leads a little bit into our next question. So Bethany.
Yeah, so my next question is, how do you discern what habits you need to practice, and how do you start them? Jen, would you be able to start us off with this question?
Sure. I don't know. I mean, I really think that the answer is a lot of trial and error, and and I am still discerning some of those practices that are important for me. I think a question that I ask myself about what different practices I engage in is what helps me to love well. And so if it pushes me towards love, then I think that that's probably a good thing for me to do. And if it pulls me away from it, then maybe I need to find something else. So that means that some of my practices are super, they don't feel very spiritual. Like I have to exercise, or I don't love people very well, and I have to get enough sleep. But then also, I don't know, lately I've been realizing that there's kind of a theme through my life of God has always spoken to me most clearly through the written word, whether that's the words of scripture or the words of other wise Christians, or through my own writing. I've had a prayer journal since I was 13 or something. And I used to kind of feel guilty, like that there are some other practices that I felt like, oh, I should probably engage in those because the real Christians do that thing. And now I'm sort of starting to own, oh no, this is who I am. So I think there's some discernment that happens in looking at how has God created you particularly? How does God speak to you particularly? Not that you shouldn't be stretched out of those things. I think that's true too. So it really is, trial and error with the community around you to help speak into that. But I think that it's also for the rest of your life. It's not a thing that you're going to figure out and then you can just stop and coast forever. I think that's. You asked how you start. I guess I don't know. I mean, you just kind of start. I don't know. Maybe someone else will have something better to say about that. But
thank you for sharing. Definitely. Rich, would you be able to answer next?
I don't know if I'll respond to it. I don't know if I'll answer the question, but when I think about discernment, discernment, it's one of my favorite words, but discernment requires, first of all, a particular kind of contemplative curiosity. And when I think about discernment, that's the phrase that comes to mind. And that in and of itself requires a particular stopping, a pausing. So discernment for me is not just about putting together a list of pros and cons, of list of things that I can do and things that that I shouldn't be doing. There's a listening, and I'm aware that kind of listening requires wise community. Right before this time together, I met with a person who's been, I guess, somewhat of a leadership coach for me, deeply godly man who hears the voice of Jesus and speaks out of that place. And we were just talking about some of the weekly habits that I just need to revisit. But I just know I needed someone outside of myself to help me think a little bit more objectively, to call out some of my own blind spots. And so discernment, I think, it's best done certainly with contemplative curiosity, listening to Jesus. But I do think it requires community alongside. And so this is about an examination of life, really. I think those who are looking into this kind of way of living would do well to study like St. Ignatius and just the Ignatian tradition of examination. And so, when I think about what are the habits, first of all, I need to ask myself, where have I been? Ignatius talks about a daily examine. And sometimes those in the Jesuits tend to practice it twice a day, actually, like at midday and then before they go to bed, where they're examining, where has God shown up? Where have I missed it? But that's good practice daily. But I think we often need a grand examine, something to help us stand, where have we been the past 2 months, 3 months? The past year, what are the themes? What are the words? What are the patterns that I've noticed? And in light of that, what does my soul need? What energizes me? What depletes me? What do I need? And so those are some of the questions. More than anything, I think if we have the right questions that can lead us down the path of discerning the right habits. And lastly, I'd say, in order to do this, to take on some habits often means that we have to let go of certain habits. And so it's often the case for me, at least, that I'd say, yeah, I'll do that. If you're Enneagram language, I'm a 7 on the Enneagram. So I want to do everything. I want to eat all the candy. I want to be at every event. Halloween is my favorite holiday. I want it all. But I recognize for myself, there are things that I have to say no to, and I don't trust myself to say no to them. So I need helpful guides along the way, whether it's my wife, whether it's a trusted friend. But those are some of the ways that I try to discern the habits. And then in terms of starting them, as Pastor Jen said, it is a matter of trial and error, of a willingness to try it and have a long view in mind that I'm not going to get this thing. I'll just give one quick anecdote here. I went to Dick's Sporting Goods 2 weeks ago because my hamstrings were so tight, and I was like, I need to start stretching my hamstrings. I'm 41 years old. I feel stiff. So I started it, and within 4 days, I was making great progress. I was like, I can almost touch my toes now. But then I stopped. And I'm back to square one. Now I could just give it up and say, I'm never stretching for the rest of the year, again, or I can just pick it up again. So I think lots of it is trial and error. Lots of it is failure. And if you can just normalize failure and normalize sputtering along the way, that'll help to integrate and reintegrate important habits for the sake of our own spiritual formation.
Wow, thank you. I definitely like your point about normalizing failure. I think that was a good point. Thank you. Danjuma, would you be able to add your thoughts about this question?
Sure. So everything that has been said before, I'm appreciative of what Rich and Jen have talked about. When I think of what habits to practice, I'm thinking, okay, the habits that I am trying to practice, or that one in ministry is looking to practice, it depends on what you're solving for. What are you trying to address? And that requires a degree of self-honesty and authenticity. And when you are tasked with preaching every week and doing so many things, it can be very easy to become dishonest with yourself. You know, some years, not every year, but some years I'll have students do what we call a genogram. I don't know if you've heard of that before, but you're looking at, you know, maybe 2 generations back in your family, and then the current generation, and you're drawing these lines. It never fails how amazed students, how we all can be amazed at how similar we are to our parents and our predecessors and our grandparents, whatever definitions you are attaching to those lines. But part of that exercise is for this. Every pastor has to be involved in their own self-work, in their self-care. I'm preaching that every week. And that requires a degree of honesty and courage to deal with unresolved issues, blocked grief, a lot of things that come from our family of origin. And there's not one pastor in the world that is not carrying their own garbage into ministry. And the more we have not dealt with whatever those unresolved grief, trauma, whatever, unnamed losses, we tend to act those out in ministry. Whatever our relational patterns were with our parents, siblings in the past, we reenact those to the, those in particular we're talking about that can be problematic and that can harm us in ministry and really harm those who we are serving. And so I tie, in discerning, when I think of discerning, it is about how authentic can we really be with ourselves? I think for a lot of people, they imagine if I'm not doing something really big, and every tradition has whatever, don't drink, the sexual things, all of that. So if I'm not doing these 5 things, I'm great. But we haven't talked to our father in 10 years, that sibling in 12 years. The holidays for a lot of people represent, for a lot of pastors, can represent just, hurtful times. And so, you were talking about how can you discern? What's the one sermon you preach that you can feel really uncomfortable about because what you are saying, you don't have under wraps at all, but you're just going with it. And it's not one of those, again, those, sins or whatever that we like to talk about. It's just, you have a lot to deal with. And so that's what I think of when I think of discerning the habits. What are my deficits? What are those things that I've repressed? And now, how do I formulate habits around these things? Or how do I form habits so I can get at those things? And a lot of that comes with self-work, the things that Jen and Rich were talking about, doing this with someone else, doing this in a space where you don't have to be pastor. I think every pastor needs a space away from the place that they are pastoring, where they can just open up and be themselves and not be pastor so-and-so or pastor so-and-so. And to allow others to pour into your life, but also where you can just be fully human. That's how I look at those habits.
Yeah, wow, thank you, Danjuma. That was, oh, sorry, Jen.
No, it's fine. It really says something that we have to say, and we do have to say that you need a place where you can be fully human. What does it mean that our pastors are required to be something other than that? And are required to like cultivate such habits that we can somehow deal with being required to be not human. I don't have much to say about that, except that it seems problematic.
No responses to that. It's just problematic, right? Like, yeah, that's, thanks for naming that, Jen. So I'm hearing a lot of self-examination being part of this. Yeah, that was something we talked about when we were preparing for this. And so that's really where Sheila's question goes.
Yeah, so as we were talking about this, we noticed how much you have to be able to evaluate yourself in order to have those contemplative rhythms and habits. So we're often not taught how to evaluate ourselves. And I'm wondering how we can learn to do this. So Rich, you kind of already touched on this in Bethany's question, but I'm wondering if you could speak more about the goal of self-evaluation and maybe what this has looked like throughout your life.
Yeah, in terms of self-evaluation, in the book, I talk about interior examination. It's the language that I use. And I think, first of all, for Christians, the goal of interior examination is not self-awareness for the sake of self-awareness. It's not self-actualization, it's not self-awareness. The goal of interior examination is, first of all, to find ourselves opening ourselves up to the places where we need God's grace and God's healing and God's mercy. And so I know a lot of people who go into this kind of interior work for the sake of just self-examination and greater self-awareness, which is a great thing. But the first thing is it puts me into position to recognize places of healing and grace that I need from God. Secondly, when I think about interior examination, the goal of it is love. Ultimately, it's love. I'm looking within to identify the places within me that's blocking the flow of God's love. And so I look within to be an extension of the love of Christ to the world around me. And the way I do it, though, it matters. I mean, the language that I think is really important to use is that we are to be curiously compassionate with ourselves, or another way of saying it is we are compassionately self-confrontational. And when we think about self-confrontation, we often don't think about compassion. It's often we see ourselves through the lens of shame, through the lens of a failure, through the lens of disappointment. But what would it look like to compassionately and curiously experience some form of self-confrontation? And so for me, that's what's at work. And it requires a life, again, back to the contemplative life here. We could either choose to slow down and do this work, or it'll be chosen for us. And it'll be chosen for us in the form of sickness. It'll be chosen for us in the form of conflicts that have come up because of the lack of rhythms that we've had. And so we can choose it, or it'll be chosen for us. And it might not be chosen for us in the next year. It might take a couple of years, but when it is chosen for us, it might put us in a position where we will reflect and think, I wish I would have chosen it for myself, because now I'm in dire straits to look within. And I think the invitation for us is to contemplatively, prayerfully, compassionately, curiously look within. But again, it's to open us up to God, and ultimately for the sake of love, not just our own self-awareness and self-actualization.
Yeah, thank you so much for that insight. Danjuma, what has this been like for you?
I don't know that I have more to add to that. It's when I look back in hindsight, it's a realization. Sometimes I'll say you have to begin ministry with the end in mind. You will not last forever. And when Rich talks about, if you don't slow down, if you choose not to slow down, it'll happen for you. When it does, your spouse or your children, they may not have you the next week, but that church will have another pastor preaching the next week. So sometimes I think there's a humility in terms of we overestimate how valuable we are at the expense of doing the contemplative work that we need to do to receive that grace from God, and to receive that grace also from the people that God has placed in our lives. I think too often we talk about this in a sort of up-down type of relationship. God uses people, and God calls us to community. And so that's the only thing that I would add. It's a sort of a realization going into ministry to have really a humble evaluation of who we are as people of faith, but also as a human being. And I think when we have a humble evaluation of who we are, then that helps us slow down and take the time out, knowing that others can fill in for us. If we have to take a sabbatical away from the ministry, and that can be hard, even if that's something that's at less pay or no pay, doing those things to make sure that we are honoring God both with ourselves and our families. That's how I think we can do what you're asking. More about realizing who we are, or an appropriate evaluation of who we are.
Yeah, thank you. I certainly appreciate the emphasis on humility there. So, Jen, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I always have things to say. Maybe a weakness of mine. You said something about the goal of self-evaluation, and it just struck me as I have done I guess more anti-racism work and my own work as a white person. One of the things I feel like I want to say is that the goal for is not my personal comfort. I think oftentimes our disciplines will lead us in an uncomfortable direction, and that's really important. But I am learning that a mark of whiteness is that we think that our personal comfort is the most important thing. And I tend to get caught in thinking if I'm not completely at peace, then something must be wrong here. And that's not always the case. I think peace is a gift of the Spirit. I think I don't want to divorce it entirely, but I do want to say we have to be led into uncomfortable places also. And then I thought, this pressure to somehow be inhuman and then cope with that. I think there's something important to say about how we slow down actually teaches our congregation both how to treat us and how to treat themselves. They are people just like us, bearing the same pressures that our society puts on them. And to say I don't check my email on these days or whatever, actually reminds us that we're human people. We have limits. We shouldn't be instantly gratifying everything. So to say, no, actually, I slow down, I take a Sabbath, you cannot contact me, the elders are available. That is educational for the congregation too. It's part of their own discipleship. So as we say, I'm going to be a human, it's been really important to me to say, I have particular gifts. They are these. I'm super bad at lots of other stuff, including email, including scheduling, including these things. At our church, we were in the, I think, a really good position of being able to say, you know, we weren't looking for a new job. So when we were doing interviewing, we had just like more power than you usually have as an interviewee. So we were like, hey, if you're looking for people that are good at scheduling and email and these things, we are not your people. So you should move on. And I think starting right from the beginning with, this is what I'm good at, this is what I'm not good at. And God has intentionally made me with particular gifts, and I will choose to live into those. And I would hope that as the body of Christ, you can also live into your gifts and it will shore up where I'm weak. All those things are going to teach your congregation or just not only who you are and how to be a human, but also how they can then turn around and be full humans loved by God. And I appreciated Rich saying, you know, this compassionate self-evaluation, that's just practicing grace, right? That's what God does for us. And so the same kind of thing, if you can be compassionate with yourself in front of other people, you are also teaching them how to be compassionate with themselves. So all of this is part of our ministry. It just requires us to be a little bit more vulnerable.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that challenge with us. So I'm going to hand the baton to Joanna, who has our next question.
Yeah, thanks. This has been amazing. One thing I want to point out from that last round of questioning is the last responses, I should say, is that it's really good and it's painful. Like there's a lot of potential for it to be painful. It's probably going to be painful, and that that's okay. Like you have to kind of go through that to you kind of have to go through it yourself so that you don't inflict that pain on other people. I think of like Henry Nouwen's The Wounded Healer, right? Like we can use our pain. If we don't acknowledge our pain, we use it to hurt other people. But if we've dealt with it, then we can use it to heal other people. So thank you. I am wondering about those things that are especially wearying to pastors. So I think of like this summer after the Breonna Taylor verdict came out, and how, well, the result of the grand jury came out, and how just wearying that I got the sense from a lot of people, but especially ministry leaders, how wearying that is when there's so much work to be done, and then there are these like setbacks, these things that feel like nothing is happening. So I wonder when you're feeling especially weary in ministry, when you feel especially like the things that God has called you to do, you don't see fruit of that right in front of you. What do you do? Like what are there practices you turn to? Are there scripture passages you turn to deal with that weariness that feels like it could potentially lead to burnout really easily? So Danjuma, would you be willing to start?
Wow, on that question.
Sorry, and I know I didn't prepare you for that question either.
No, you didn't. Looking at the email, I don't see Breonna Taylor in the email. Wow,
No.
okay.
Sorry.
So I think first and foremost, whether a pastor feels that anxiety is just based on the context and where they are. Some places didn't feel that anxiety. What comes to mind, and this was a part of my doctoral project, I think of Hebrews 12, one of my, 11 and 12, both chapters among my favorite in scripture. And in 11, one of the things that jumps out to me is he talks about those who died in the faith but hadn't received the promise. I resonate with that. I have a people and a heritage that comes from that. So now it takes away the concept of winning from faith. That faith is not about winning. It's not about what you see in this lifetime. It has to be something greater than that. But then you go to Hebrews 12, and it talks about this cloud of witnesses. So what I have found for me, and this goes to my central to my doctoral work, this is where tradition can be so powerful and where autobiography can be so powerful. What did the people of God do before you? And as you tap into their stories and you begin to understand that the suffering that you are incurring, the weariness, it is not something that is uncommon to man. This isn't but a cycle. And when you look at the cloud of witnesses, when you look at the people who have gone before you, sometimes you have to talk to yourself, like David says, you have to just talk to yourself. And you know that you really represent the prayers of great, great, great grandfathers and grandmothers and praying saints who had no idea or couldn't see where we are today, but it was their hope and their prayer. And that is how I sustain. I have to look back at those who have gone before me. This is just Danjuma Gibson. The people of God who have gone before me, to see their struggles, to see their pain, to see that, you know what, they died in the faith without having to see the promises, but they believed that I would be here. Now that tells me I have to reorient. Besides from winning, I have to live for somebody else. My faith now also has to be about someone else. It can't just be Danjuma's comfort. When will I see this? We are a by Friday society. We want to see everything done by Friday. But the kind of faith that says we may leave out of here, or we may pay the ultimate price. We may die in the faith, not seeing it, but we're doing it for somebody else to come after us that lays that foundation. And that is what keeps me going in the midst of all of this. I think we have to do more and sometimes it's a challenge with a contemporary generation. I understand we can't just throw tradition out. Sometimes that can be the temptation in the present. But tradition has done it. We have the burden of proof on us to say what's right or what's wrong with tradition. And so looking back at the saints, and I'm saying saints, I'm sorry, that's just my tradition where I come from. Looking back at the saints, looking back at the people of God, knowing that someone else has walked this road before me, that energizes me. And I hope that my prayers will manifest in someone else. I'm sorry if I went long on that. That just sort of triggered me there.
Amen. Thank you. That was, powerful. Rich, could you respond?
Yeah, when the disorientation, the challenges that, in light of just social challenges, where do I go? Well, I'll tell you, I'm not sure if these are positive things, but I'll go here first and then tell you where do I go? I often go to Oreo cookies and threatening my children to give me hugs multiple times a day in order to get by in a given day. Video games when they go to bed. I mean, those are typically the ways that I'm trying to survive in a world that's marked by political hostility, racial injustice, social anxiety, public health crisis, economic disruption. I mean, those are some of the places that I go. When I'm in a better place, and the video games have been really helpful for me, but I'm in a better place, I am trying to cultivate a spirituality of lamenting. And lamenting it's more than just feeling sad. It is an act of faith of lifting that grief up to God and opening ourselves up to the possibility of a new social imagination and a new personal imagination. And so Ron Rollheiser, who writes a lot about prayer, he said very simply that prayer is lifting mind and heart to God. And so whatever every feeling, every thought becomes an entryway into a life of prayer. And in Christian tradition, and this cuts across evangelical traditions, charismatic traditions, Pentecostal traditions, progressive traditions across the board, it's often very difficult to allow yourself to feel grief and sadness in the name of Jesus often. And so where do I go? I mean, I'm trying to, we use a very simple skill at New Life where we call it exploring the iceberg. And we're trying to help people name some of the more foundational interior movements and emotions of our soul, of sadness, anger, anxiety, and joy. And it's in the simplicity of those questions. What are you sad about? What are you mad about? What are you anxious about? And then, and then what are you glad about? Those simple questions have a way of accessing points of our soul and parts of our soul that often go untouched. And so cultivating a spirituality of lament has been incredibly important. And then I think lastly for me is part of that lamenting requires various spaces. And so I think we all need spaces. I meet with 3 other pastor friends the first Wednesday of each month from 4 p.m. to 5:30 for an hour and a half. And the goal of that for us is to share, what we're learning, what we're reading, but it's a space to also share our grief, our laments, what we're wrestling with, what's been disappointing, who's leaving our church because of something that we've preached, the challenges that we're experiencing. So a spirituality of lament, as well as those formational spaces where we can open ourselves up to others, has been some of the ways that I've tried to navigate what has been perhaps the most difficult, not just ministry year, but year period, personally and socially.
Yeah, thank you. Jen.
You are both very wise, and I'm grateful to be listening to you as we do this. I find video games helpful also. But
we're doing a lot of Animal Crossing in our house, by the way. So
I return to just a couple of kind of touch points for myself. One is a quote by C.S. Lewis, where he says, "Be comforted, small one, in your smallness. He has laid no merit on you. Have no fear," or wait, "receive and be glad. Have no fear, lest your shoulders be bearing the world." And that practice of being small in the midst of it helps me to not feel like I have to bear the weight. Like I can grieve and I can do what I can do. And I think that's very important. But it doesn't help anybody if I get overwhelmed and so stop being able to function in those things. I also remind myself that my calling is always the same, no matter what is happening around me, that my calling is always to love God and love neighbor. Whether we're in the midst of a pandemic or we're collectively rejoicing over something, it's still the same. And that helps ground me, I think. And then lately, and I think these things are related, lately I have been obsessed with planting trees. And I think that's probably because it is such a clear good. It does feel like, oh, we're working, to care for the environment, and that is pretty important right now. It also feels like I'm returning to my, first vocation as a gardener. That's what humanity was put here for, was to care for the garden. So planting trees just feels like nobody's going to get mad about it. No, it's not complicated. And I also am like in touch with my own humanity in some particular way. And I find that very grounding also, that it's just clear in a place where everything is fraught with debate, argument, it's complicated. Just, it doesn't seem like there are really clear ways forward for a lot of things. So I've been planting trees, and it's just a grounding practice for me. That also feels like I'm still doing good work. This is, I think tree planting is among, it's one of it's work of the kingdom, but it's also, it's just very helpful for me.
Thank you. Thank you. I know that was, there's a lot that we have to deal with as ministry leaders, that we have to help our congregations navigate through. And so I appreciate you engaging that question, even though it came as a little bit of a surprise to you. I'd like to close by hearing just kind of a bit of testimony, essentially, from you. So the question is, how have you seen a change in your life or ministry, or both, due to transformative habits that you have engaged? And we hope that for people who are watching this, that it's like, hey, I can do this. Like they leave saying, hey, I can start one habit. So how have you seen a change in your life due to transformative habits? Rich, can you start?
Yeah, when I think of two things that have really helped me on the journey of pastoring and leading, being a father, a husband, friend, two practices. One of which is just centering prayer. And centering prayer, I'm in my bedroom. This is the chair in my bedroom. This is my prayer chair. And this is a place where I just open up my hands and set my a timer for 5, 10, 15 minutes. And just, I am here just to share presence with Jesus. And I'm not here to get anything out of it. I'm not here to give a laundry list of things that I need God to do in my life. Not that I don't do those things, but there are times where I'm just opening myself up to share presence with Jesus. And what that has done for me is it has allowed me, I think, to be more present with people. And so this simple task of not doing anything, not accomplishing anything, not scrolling through anything, not reading anything, and with my mind getting distracted 100 times in 10 minutes, I think over time, this has helped me to truly be present with people. So that's the first practice that I invite people to pursue and research centering prayer. So the second is, there's a practice that I give myself to of monitoring my anxiety and my disproportionate reactions to things, and which happens every week because there's differences in so many things politically, masks, how we're going to move the church forward across the board, racially. There's plenty of opportunities for anxiety to come to the surface. And so whenever I get triggered by anxious moments, there's a 5-step practice that I've given myself to. And I started this over 2 years ago. And very simply, it's this. It's whenever anxiety comes, or whenever there's a disproportionate reaction in me to something, I ask myself these 5 questions. What happened? What am I feeling? What's the story I'm telling myself? What's the gospel say? And what's the counter-instinctual act that's required? And I'll just I talk about a little bit of this in the book here, but I remember a couple of years ago, I was critiqued by a really well-known Christian leader in our nation. If I said the name, everyone, all of you would know it. And this person had sent me a private message on Instagram critiquing something that I've put up. It was said in love. There was no word of condescension. There was no, no little, it was nothing problematic with it. But for me, my soul at that moment was so fragile. My response was, who do you think you are sending me that? That was my first response, and then I just got off of Instagram and probably said some things I shouldn't have said under my breath. But because I was going through that 5-step process during that period, I was able to shorten the time span that I find myself in an emotional hole of, and here's very, very simply, and I've had to do this many times over the past couple of years. And so this is how it works out. What happened? A well-known leader criticized me. What am I feeling? Shame, deep shame. What's the story I'm telling myself? I will never be the competent leader that I want to be. What's the gospel say? God has a way of using incompetent leaders. And then what's the counter-instinctual act that's required for me? It's letting someone in so that I'm not alone in my own angst and my own anxiety. And when I go down an emotional hole, I'm letting someone else in my case, my wife or some trusted friends. Those centering prayer and the examination of my own anxiety have been two practices that have helped me to live, I think, with greater joy, greater presence with people. And to have helped me to navigate some of the more challenging realities of just living life. So those are the two things that have helped me.
Thank you. That's really helpful, very tangible for people to take home with them. I appreciate that. Thanks. Danjuma, what are practices, or how have transformative practices shaped your life in ministry?
I'm afraid it's not sophisticated. I like running. Even back in Chicago, my church would know, even before I preach, I have to run. It is just something, but it's a particular time. For me, it's running in the still of the morning, 5:30 a.m., 6 a.m. It's just me and my creator. And there's so much I can process. There's so much, now I'm not a fast runner. I didn't say it looks pretty, but I get through it. Sometimes when I'm running around Calvin, I'll see one of these younger people pass me up several times, and I'll imagine to myself, they're cutting through the middle of campus. They're not really running the full circle. So I'm a very slow runner, but it's, I find that just time away, wherever you can get it, where it is, it's not what you do, it's the nature of what you do, where you lose all sense, where you lose a sense of time and space. You're in a liminal space. That centers me for the rest of the day. Now it's gotten more difficult with some of the things going on in our society now. But whatever you can do, I know for me, that particular activity, not the running itself, but what it does for me, the quiet, the liminal space, has been something that I've been doing for some time now. And yeah, that's what I do.
Thank you. Again, it feels very like we've been talking about these practices and how, what they do for us. And it can sound really intimidating. And I appreciate the way that this is, just making it seem so much more manageable. All right, Jen, tell us about your practices.
Running and centering prayer have both been very helpful for me. So I'm not alone. I tend to be kind of inconsistent. Like I change what I'm doing frequently. I think that's a mark of my own, I'm an Enneagram 4. I think we tend to do that. Things only work for me for about 3 months. But it's some things that, keeping a Sabbath has been very important to me. I think that Sabbath is one of the most countercultural things that we can do right now. And I think it makes a whole day of that liminal space. I mean, I have 3 small children, so Sabbath is not that Sabbathy right now. But when it can be, it is amazing to be able to say, no, I cannot work right now. God told me not to work. And to just receive that as a gift. Just plug in my computer while I talk. And then I think something I'm trying to do right now has been just trying to be present. I have a ton of anxiety, but I notice a very, just a very noticeable shift in my way of being when I just actually stop to look at what's happening. It's amazing how I can go through so much of my day without actually really looking at anything and attending to it. It helps with my kids when they're like 6 and 5 and 5. So I have 5-year-old twins, and then the girls who are the 5-year-olds do a ton of screaming, which is the opposite of spiritual discipline. It's so awful. But it is helpful for me, even in the midst of the turmoil, someone screaming and the other 2 are trying to ask me questions and demanding a cup of water and whatever else is happening, that I can actually just stop and look at it. And I find a way in that to be present. And there's something very different. You know, it's so popular. Mindfulness is all over the place right now. But, you know, Augustine talked about that. He talked about the future and the past don't really exist for us. Only the present does. And so the only place that we can be with God is in the present. And the farthest that we try to stretch ourselves out of that place, we're behaving, I mean, again, I keep coming back to human limits. When we think that we can function in the future or fix something that happened in the past, we're acting outside of our own limits. We can only be exactly where we are in our bodies. So that's just a really helpful practice to me, to like remember that I have a body. God is the one who can, consider the future and the past, and I am only right here. So it's kind of a small thing, but it's very actually difficult to be present in those spaces. So.
Yeah, I agree. It's very difficult to be present in those spaces. Thanks for speaking into that and for talking about what it's like, with the kids. Like, okay, my 5 and 6-year-old are currently screaming downstairs, and I'm trying to keep them quiet. And there's this sense that sometimes when people hear us talk about well, in this particular case here, you talk about the practices, it's like idealized, and you sort of just like pulled the rug out from under that. Like, I practice mindfulness while my children are screaming. Like, what else can we do? Right. So that's really helpful. And I appreciate that.
Actually, can I say something to that? Because I was thinking about this morning, that for the first, when my girls were born, having twins is no joke. It is no joke. Like, I literally don't remember 3 years of my life, but I was angry with God actually for not, like, I need quiet time in the day to be a functional human. Like, I need to pray. I'm a different person when I pray than when I don't. And there just was not space. And I felt like God should just give me a break, like somehow enable me to function differently, but God did not. I just still needed that time. But I'm starting to learn now that there are disciplines that I can practice with them where they actually can teach me, like play. Play is a great spiritual discipline, particularly in our culture. So to sit down and play and have no goals for it, but to let them lead and not be in charge, that's actually a really important discipline for me. And they can teach me how to do it in a better way than I can. And then certain things like Advent's coming up and we're going to light the Advent candles, and their anticipation of lighting the next candle teaches me about the anticipating Christ. So there are some ways in which our kids though they might take us away from particular kinds of discipline, I think can help us engage other kinds. So I think I'm just starting to learn that. Maybe it's too late for me.
Thanks. One thing I've heard as a theme as well is this is not like a one and done sort of thing. Like, we learn new disciplines. We have the need to practice new disciplines throughout our lives. Our lives have different seasons to them, and our postures change during those seasons. Danjuma and Rich, I want to give you one more opportunity to have any insights or closing words for us.
I don't have any.
The only thing I'd say, and this is fresh in my mind because I had a conversation with a younger pastor friend of mine, and he was perplexed that he had a hard time being with God because he was so busy doing for God. And he just said, I can't be with God because I'm always doing for God. And he asked me, he says, I'm trying to figure out how to enjoy it. And my response to him was essentially this, and I think this is good for me and for everyone. I said, where did you get the idea that joy was a part of this thing here? And what I meant by that was not that God doesn't give joy when we do these practices and when we slow down to be with God. The joy starts flowing at times. But if we are waiting to feel joyful about getting into particular practices of formation, and we're waiting until joy comes before we start it, we're never going to do anything. And what this reminds me of is to follow Jesus means to take up our cross and to follow him. And that's not taking up some jewelry. That is allow yourself to experience, and Joanna, I think is when you just said it, this is painful. This is difficult. We are being decentered out of in worship and in prayer. And if we think that this thing is about being joyful first before we can step into it, we're never going to do it. To follow Christ, whether it's in silence, whether it's in works of justice, whether it's in serving the poor, this is taking up the cross and doing something that's painful, that doesn't feel good often. And we often find the fruit in retrospect. It's only after we look back to see, oh, look how far I've come. Oh, look at the fruit that's been produced. We don't see it in the moment. And so if we're waiting to see it in the moment, like I typically do, it's not going to happen. And if we're waiting for joy to be the prerequisite before we step into some of these things, it's not going to happen as well. Following Jesus means taking up our cross. And this has application across the board.
Amen. Thank you. I want to thank each of you, Rich and Jen and Danjuma, for this wonderful conversation. And I want to thank everybody who's listening to this conversation as well and watching online. We'd love for you to add your insights on the webpage in the comments below the video. And we are eager to learn from everyone and to hear what practices you are engaging in order to work out of God's strength and not your own. Thank you.